Those of you online may have to say you're okay with the recording starting, and just note that we will be using this later as part of always we do as the seminar to be published on our YouTube channel. So that may shape the things you choose to say or not to say. Anyway, let's get back to the slide here, and I will just make sure that's sharing properly with those who are online. Okay, so I won't go through all that again, but welcome. And welcome to a really special seminar for us, which is the inaugural seminar celebrating the Richard Deswarte Prize in Digital History. Peter, who was chair of the committee for the Deswarte Prize, Peter Webster, is going to say a few words in a moment about kind of the origins of the prize and where it came about. But I'm really delighted to be able to welcome Pim Huijnen today, one of the two prize winners, to speak about their paper. A few points of order before we start. So the way we're going to run this is slightly different to our usual seminars. So after I finish introducing, I'm going to hand over to Peter and then to Matthias Neumann as well. We'll say a few words as well about Richard and the prize. Before we move on to a short video, which Pim has kindly pre-recorded for us, just to ensure really that the tech doesn't fail us on this particular occasion. I won't, for those of you online, I'm not going to play the video through the online. I'm going to give you a link to it instead, because that makes much more sense. So at that point, you can mute your sound coming through the Teams. And then we'll go to Q&A at the end with Pim about the paper and the origins of it. Beforehand to Peter, I just want to say there's a number of colleagues who can't be here tonight for different reasons who sent their apologies, including Jane Winters, Tim Hitchcock, Adam Crimble and John Levin, all of whom send their regards to us this evening on this occasion of this inaugural prize for the Richard Deswarte Prize in Digital History. So I will then hand over to Peter.
Thank you very much indeed, Richard. Good evening, everybody. It was a measure of the esteem and indeed the affection in which Richard was held, that the idea of honouring him in some way emerged spontaneously and in several different minds, and pretty soon after his passing, and as did a team of colleagues and friends associated with the IHR in this seminar who were able and willing to carry it out. And so today sees the first fruition of that scheme, with which I think I can safely say Richard himself would have been delighted. And it was my privilege, as James said, to chair the panel of judges. Back in early 2011, when Richard and I were among the first set of conveners of this seminar, there was a strong feeling that the seminar should try to do something a bit different to most of the digital history presentations that we were hearing at the time. There's always room in digital history, as I understand it, for experimental work with a new tool or a new approach, the main importance of which is as a report of a technical success or failure. But at the time, we wanted to encourage something which was slightly rarer, that's to say the kind of digital history work which also aimed to contribute to its particular field, to be more than a hammer in search of a nail, as it were. Both of those approaches we try to encourage in the call for nominations for this first Deswarte Prize, and it's a great encouragement to me to see just how much work there now is that embodies both approaches, a most, I think, welcome sign of a kind of maturity in the field as we see it. As a panel of judges, we were presented with a feast of new work. It came from authors from across the world. It employed methods that were tried and tested, or others that were still emerging. It involved sources of all kinds, from the digitized to the born digital. It was delivered in formats from the traditional printed article through to datasets at interactive websites of various types. And it spoke into the historiographies of many periods and many countries. As a panel, we decided to commend in particular the entry which we placed second, that entitled Beyond Guanxi, Chinese Historical Networks, which was a special issue of the Journal of Historical Network Research, edited by Henrika Rudolph and Song Chen. But the winning entry that we're going to hear about this evening, Something Happened to the Future, impressed the panel a great deal. It had a compelling interweaving of methodological sophistication on one hand, with what is a far-reaching intervention in the historiography of its period, of its country, and I think more widely. It exemplifies the kind of impact that digital history can have on the discipline as a whole, and I think it's a worthy tribute to the memory of a dear friend and colleague. Thank you, everyone. Back to you, James.
Thank you so much, Peter, for those really kind and generous words. And yeah, as a member of the panel, I heartily agree that the quality entries was wonderful to see, and does suggest that in the life of this seminar and other comparable kind of groups, we've really managed to generate as a subfield a really mature understanding of how one might go about using computational and digital approaches to approach historical phenomena. I'll hand over then just briefly then to Matthias.
Yeah, thank you, James. I just want to say very briefly on behalf of Arden, Richard's wife, the School of History at the University of East Anglia, Richard colleagues, that we, thank you for creating this prize to recognize Richard's contribution to the field of digital history. Arden's wife, with her own Dutch heritage, is particularly delighted that the first prize goes to such worthy authors from the Netherlands, and said that Richard would be greatly interested in reading that research. Richard, as you all know, was not only a historian of digital history, but also a historian of who's interested in intellectual development of European integration, and he published in both fields. But I think that the one thing that really defines Richard, in my opinion, is that, and his contribution to scholarship in both fields, is that it by far transcends his own published work. We all know that Richard wasn't the man for, to win prizes on the number of outputs. Most of his citations he probably picked up in people's acknowledgements and in books and articles. And when we awarded him an honorary doctorate at UEA a month ago or so, I thought about this, and I looked at my first ever published work, when I was a PhD student, and there he was, first person mentioned after my supervisor, commenting on an article, reading it closely in a subject area that wasn't his own. And I just put Richard Deswarte into Google Scholar, and I found lots of acknowledgements in the field of, from colleagues that I know from UEA, but also colleagues that are involved in this group. And I think that's really a defining thing here. He would always take the time to read colleagues' work. He showed genuine interest and intellectual curiosity for their research, and provided sound and really perceptive feedback. And I think his appearances in so many acknowledgements are a real mark of his collegiality, but also, I think, a sign of the esteem in which we held his scholarship, because we valued his opinion, we valued his scholarship. So I just think it's so often we all are reduced as academics to metrics, outputs, published outputs. And I think Richard is a perfect example that scholarship can be influential in so many different ways. And so I think it's wonderful for Richard to be recognized in that ways. And with that, I will hand over back to James. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And yeah, I think that's something many of us feel as well, that Richard wasn't necessarily the person who was kind of always giving the papers necessarily, or the person who we saw giving keynotes at conferences, but he was the person who asked the perceptive questions. He was the person who always had that kind of collegial approach to, well, of course I'll read that piece of work. Of course I'll kind of comment on that piece of work. And yeah, is someone who I'm sure, if we look back through many different types of fields, from internet histories to transnational histories, we'll find him in acknowledgement sections as a colleague who provided invaluable advice during that period of, we all need where we're preparing our works for publication. So thank you. Right, so I'm now going to move on to the presentation. As I said at the beginning, Pim has kindly provided us with a pre-recording to ensure the technology doesn't go wrong. What I'm going to suggest is at this point, I'm going to put in the chat for those online a link to YouTube where you can watch the video of that there. I'll turn the video off in the room, so you're not those online getting a bit of both, and we'll play it in the room, you watch it online, and when we're done, we'll give it a couple of minutes and then we'll come back for a Q&A with Pim. So if you just give me a moment, I will stick the link in the chat, if I can find it. There we go. Where am I going now? I'm going here, I'm going here. I get lost on Teams. This is always great, isn't it? There we go. Right. So hopefully those of you who are online can now see a link. And if someone could confirm in the chat that they can see a link, that would be great.
Yeah, we got it.
Excellent. And I am going to turn off the mic and the camera now, and we're going to watch it in the room, and then we'll come back in, if I remember rightly, it's about 13 minutes. So I'll see you all online soon.
Very pleasant surprise, the jury of the Richard Deswarte Prize for Digital History
Okay, I'm hoping by this point those online have also finished watching Pim's presentation, and we can move into a Q&A. How I'm going to attempt to chair this is that I'll start with a question for Pim, and then if you want to ask a question, either if you're in the room, please raise your hand, or if you're online, please use the reactions thing within Teams to raise your hand, or just put an X in the chat and I'll come to you. If you'd rather just type out a question, those online, you're more than welcome to, and we can deal with it that way. But I can unmute people if they'd like to speak as well, which I'm more than happy to. So while those in the room are thinking, my opening question for Pim actually is about Dutch. And it's about one of the things that I remember when reading the paper was that you go to great lengths to ensure that an Anglophone audience can really understand the arguments you're making, but you do make some very particular points about the nature of the Dutch language and how sort of futures are spoken about in different kind of frameworks. And I wonder if you could just sort of briefly sort of reflect on not necessarily writing a paper in English when your sources are in Dutch, because I think, you know, people whose first language isn't English will do that all the time, but more because you're studying the language itself. What kind of complexities really jumped out to you in a way that felt they needed extra attention when kind of speaking outside of a kind of Dutch audience, or a kind of not just writing in English, but speaking outside of people who know kind of, you know, Dutch culture and Dutch history and things like that. So I wonder if you could just reflect a bit on that for us.
Yes, thank you, James, for this wonderful question. And allow me this opportunity first to again express my thanks to you for the prize, obviously, but also for your so kind and really generous words. And I know that I also speak on behalf of Joris, who's really sorry that he couldn't be here today. But we're I know I also said this in the talk that you just watched, but I really like to repeat myself that we're really honored and well, very surprised, but still very honored having received this prize. Now, as for your question, like I said, it's a wonderful question, and it's something that being not English is at times challenging. Because like you said, it is very much about the tales of Dutch language at times, right? Sometimes some things are easily translatable. The faraway future, the near future, the future period, but the Dutch and particularly Dutch politicians tend to have their very own lingo, like the British will have as well, I take it. And these sometimes are words that Dutch people immediately recognize, understand, and know the context of, but that are very, very difficult to translate into a different language. So one obvious example from our article is malleability, maakbaarheid. That's really a thing in the Netherlands, or has been a thing. It's not something that the politicians still talk about, but the idea of malleability, makeability, yeah, translations really don't work here. It was for decades on end fundamental to a particular type of politics in the Netherlands, left-wing politics. So much so that that it turned into a type of society, maakbaarheidssamenleving, and that's as an author, you then have to make a decision, right? And do I turn this into a paragraph, something that Dutch readers would immediately understand and wouldn't need, or shall we rather focus on different things? Another example is spoorboekjesmentaliteit. Yeah, that's a great one for those of you. I don't know if there's anybody there online who speaks Dutch, but that's a wonderful Scrabble word. It refers to a very particular mentality, sort of bureaucratic, but that's not something that you again have to explain for the Dutch, and that you do have to in an article like this. And yeah, my point again is it decides, things like these decide what you in the end really focus on, where your article is heading, because you cannot necessarily focus on everything or write everything that you would ideally want to. We would obviously have the alternative of also publishing a Dutch article, but that's not something that we explicitly discussed. I'm still looking for spoorboekjesmentaliteit in the article, but is that kind of an answer to your question, James?
No, it is, and I was thinking of it in terms of, as well as like the ways in which sort of you approach a language with a kind of sense of what sort of, say, futurism sounds like, or what it looks like, or what sort of notions of the past look like or sound like, and I guess I was intrigued by those kind of examples you pick out, where you have to go into kind of quite distinct political languages, which, as you describe, sort of they're invoking the future, but not necessarily through a kind of a linguistic construction of futurism necessarily. It's more kind of conceptual things. I think that's one of the things that was really interesting and rich about the work, about sort of the way in which you collectively used, sort of, as you describe it, the kind of knowledges of the kind of political ideologies as a way of thinking about proxies for futurism, and how future was spoken about in different periods over this 200-year period. So yeah. Thank you. Questions from the room or online? Tessa?
Hi. So my question relates mostly to your talk, not so much immediately to the paper, but it also refers to what you were just talking about and the type of politician you have in the Netherlands at the moment, and is this style appropriate for the moment? And then, right, okay, so give me a second to formulate the question. you said in a way that something changes in the 70s and 80s, and you seem to suggest this idea of what the future is and how the future is something that we can shape or not changes at around this time. And you showed these quotes around from the 1990s that it's not the time to build utopias anymore, right? And that seems to fit in right with like this end of history idea Jameson said in the 90s, right? If we cannot even think about utopias, what's left then, or what does it say about what we can imagine in terms of the future? So something seems to have happened there, this kind of neoliberal ascendancy, right? No alternatives and so on. And then you were saying, okay, so now we live in a time when so my question is, you seem to suggest now we live in a time where we maybe need that again. And did I understand correctly that you're referring to sort of climate emergency, a need for climate change, that we need these visions for the future again, that this is sort of like, at least politically, what is required? Is that where you were going with this, or did I misunderstand this?
No, not at all, Tessa. Thank you for this question. No, that's exactly what I meant. Yeah, this is not a political setting, obviously, but
I know. But
whenever I get the chance, or I cannot help myself, and yeah, especially not to criticize the current government. But yeah, I think it's very typical that or rather to approach this, what these politicians have done since the 1970s and 80s is simply yeah, they made the future sort of disappear, right? They turned our attention towards the present and said, well, this is where the problems are. This is what we're going to work on. Elect me because I'm good for the present, not so much for a far away, a distant and not very concrete future. But I think, yeah, and I'm really thinking about climate change here. The urgent problems of our day now, yeah, of course they're here. We have to do something now, and they're talking in Egypt about that as we speak. But it refers to a future, right? And I think, yeah, for politicians, there's not so much to gain to say, well, in 30 years or 50 years, things are going to be great, right? They want to make things great. Well, yeah, right away. Ideally, but I think that's not the scope, the mental scope that we should have now facing these problems. And if you look at scholarship, historical or more generally scholarly debates, yeah, they have moved on from this blind focus on the present towards, well, yeah. Keyword Anthropocene, for example, right? This necessitates a different scope. Maybe this is, well, for us historians, the most difficult turn to make of all scholars or fields of study, because we have been taught to think in terms of generations, of individuals, what they can do. And yeah, I really like the scholarship that's been going on for well, a small number of years now, where people state, well, we especially as historians have to learn to think on a much wider scale, because that's where the problems are, and that's also where our current problems originate from, right? Yeah, we're talking centuries here.
Thank you. Peter.
Pim, thank you very much indeed for that. It's a fascinating paper, and thank you for talking about it this evening. I wonder if I might just kind of pick a little bit at actually what you think might be going on politically and in terms of government and administration that's behind this shift that you see happening in the 70s and 80s. Perhaps, so I come at this as someone interested in 20th century Britain, and I have no idea whether or not there is a comparable kind of shift in language, but I can kind of imagine the political conditions that might actually have enabled it in the UK, which to say kind of two developments, one which precedes the other. The first one being, particularly after the Second World War, a massive expansion in the competence of the state, and that the state takes on hugely expanded roles in terms of healthcare and education and social insurance and all of these various other things, coupled with a certain kind of cult of science and technological advance in that first 20 years or so, such that actually the number of possible futures that the state and therefore politicians could do anything about has expanded, right? There are more things about the futures of which you can start to speak, which speaks to the point about these terms being more generative, as you did. And then I suspect that in the UK that then runs into a loss of confidence probably in the early 1970s, that has something to do with something to do with the ideological shift in the 60s. It has something to do with economic difficulties in relation to oil and all of those other things. And I wonder whether any of that kind of chimes with what might be going on in the situation in the Netherlands. I just wonder whether that kind of rings any bells with you looking at it from a different perspective.
Yes, thank you, Peter. Again, a great question, and actually it does. I think your interpretation is very much in line with what we think, and yeah, we haven't given or haven't gone that widely in giving context, right, where these changes have been coming from, but yeah, but I would search them in the very same direction. And what I'm thinking mostly about here, I think the hypothesis of an expanding administration and expanding government is really interesting and makes absolute sense. And the same is happening in that time in the Netherlands. Yeah, but that's something that I'd have to think about. What I'm mostly thinking about here is those things that start to happen in the 1970s, like the oil crisis. My feeling would be that that up until then, yeah, things have been progressing and have been moving forward, and cheap energy, particularly in the Netherlands, where this huge gas field was discovered in 1959. Yeah, cheap energy was a given, and then all of a sudden you have in the 1970s these I don't know if you had them in the UK, but these Sundays where you weren't allowed to drive your car, and that must have been a very material realization for people, that things aren't as obvious as they would have thought, and that things do not necessarily always move in the direction they are thinking of. That and for example, the Brundtland report in what is it, 1972, the first report to address climate and environmental problems, and I do think these caused quite some struggles politically about, okay, yeah, how to cope with these risks, with these perhaps growing problems, and yeah, maybe a loss of a belief in a future that was necessarily, yeah, moving in a progressive way. Yes, is this a sort of an answer?
Oh, yes, yes, very much so. I have another question for later, but I'll save it. I'll let other people go in first.
Can I just come in very quickly on, because you've talked a lot about the 1970s and the post-war period, but of course your paper goes earlier, Pim, and you locate this turning point very late in a long historical period, and that again is quite an intriguing kind of framing for me in terms of how this paper set out. And what can you say about the sort of the period before 1914? Is it because broadly in the way you were looking at this, political language kind of was quite static over a kind of a long run? Or is it more just because sort of the talk about the future is more sparse in those periods?
Yeah, excellent question. Well, what you see in the article is really our argument getting shape. So we somewhere at the start of the article we do refer to this, but we started out not necessarily solely focusing on the future. I really well, yeah, I still think it's a great topic, and we're gonna keep working on this. But my initial interest also had to do with the past. Well, yeah, like the examples I gave in my recording, the way the past is used by politicians, and yeah, more generally. Referring to Koselleck's theory, the relation or the changing relation between the past, the present, and the future. So it wasn't from the get-go solely the future that we wanted to focus on. We did, yes, several initial experiments searching for the words referring to the past, to the present, to the future, etc. And this really is what we got out of the data. So referring to your question, so it wasn't that we also started out and thinking, okay, it's the post-war decades that we're going to focus on, or that's where things are changing, but it's simply that those very general frequency plots of words referring to the future, to the past, that we studied. And this is simply what came out as the most interesting period. So yeah, your hunch is sort of correct. The future was used before in political speech, but things didn't really change that much for the 19th century and the first half of the 20th century. This is where things really started, and we didn't know what was happening initially. And yeah, well, we still do not fully know, but what you see is, of course, our interpretation of what we think is happening. But what's for sure is that in those decades and towards the end of the 20th century, that's where things really changed. So hence our kind of vague title, right? So something happened to the future, and that's what we set out to to flesh out.
Thank you so much. Anyone else in the room have a question? Alexandra.
Thank you so much. I wanted to ask you a little about how conceptual historians have responded to your methodology. Obviously, I'm very convinced sitting in this room about what you say about the productivity of conceptual history and digital approaches, combined are very, very productive, very fruitful. But I know from intellectual history more generally, there is still this degree of skepticism when it comes to digital approaches and how we can use digital history and blend it with intellectual history as a more kind of traditional, however we want to interpret it, kind of school. So I'm just wondering if you could tell us a little bit about how kind of more traditional humanities conceptual historians have responded to your approach, and whether they, have really been as, taken by it as we all are as digital historians.
Yes, thank you. That's a great question. Yeah, it isn't something that they are necessarily interested in or convinced by, right? Just as you said, but this isn't typical for conceptual historians. I think it's at least in my experience. Yeah, this goes for historians from almost all fields. But I think that these techniques, yeah, like I also addressed in my talk, make for a great fit with conceptual history. These techniques often work with words, obviously, and you can translate concepts into words. So that's where they relate to each other. So yeah, we did, particularly when it is about the publication of this article, we did have to make considerable changes during the review process, but it was accepted on those conditions quite easily, I should say. I think, and maybe that's also typical for conceptual history, yeah, that there will be a lot of historians who will never get to accept these techniques or understand them, or yeah, often probably both. But I do know in conceptual history that these techniques exist, that new computational approaches to conceptual history exist, and it is also my experience that there's also a general willingness and also curiosity to learn more about them. So yeah, that's still not the same as being easily convinced that they work or that what you present, yeah, is serious. But this initial curiosity is something that I experience quite often. Yeah, interestingly, one of the biggest problems we had getting our article published was our argument that we don't do statistics, that statistical relevance is not our argument here. That would be very difficult, I think, because yeah, you would really have to build some kind of model, right? In the sense that you have to reduce all the variables, so make things simpler. Only talk about the word future, for example, but not all those synonyms or related words that imply something future. So we talk in terms of probability. What's the word? That's not that's of course referring to significance, but what's the word that we? Sorry?
It's a possibility you talk about quite a lot, isn't it? Seem to remember.
Yeah, definitely. That's what it implies, right? But yeah, I'm sorry, that's a bit embarrassing. But we do have a word that I believe really brings it to the point. Plausibility, yeah, is what I mean. Sorry, yeah, that's of course how or where we really tell we are historians. We're not computer scientists or social scientists working with statistical significance. That's not something that we would argue for. This is how we do it, and that was not that was my point. That was not accepted right away. We did get questions. Yeah, where's the significance? Where's the statistics? And I'm very glad that we hung on to our argument and to our approach, because I think this is really how historians yeah, not necessarily should work, but I do find it very valuable getting this accepted as an approach next to yeah, doing statistics. But that again, yeah, wasn't very easy. So the whole review process was kind of tiresome. But in the end, yeah, we were happy. It got published, obviously.
Can I just comment on that?
Go on.
It's interesting that you said this was a point of criticism that you got, because I think, especially for the judges, without giving too much away, but I think when we're talking about your paper, we're all saying that we really like this aspect, that you were so sort of relaxed about this, that you're saying, listen guys, don't worry about these statistics. This is how we do it. This is how we work as historians, right? We'll stick with these methods, and it's about plausibility, and it's not about proving statistical significance here. And we thought that this made also the paper quite accessible for people who are maybe not so familiar with it, that it's not so overwhelming, right? Here's our model and so on. And I think this was, I thought, yeah, a source of strength of the paper, especially. So it's interesting that other people didn't like this, especially this bit. Yeah. Anyway.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you. That is great to hear. And I think, yeah, it would really, or it is really the wrong way to move forward, to adopt a quasi-scientific model. And talk about statistical significance all the time, because we all know, well, nothing is easier than to present some statistics, right? But yeah, as if that means something. Yeah, and it's very easy to make your paper very difficult in that way, just like you said. But that's, I think this is the harder thing to do, but yeah, more true to what we are familiar with and trained in as historians, and that's of course the audience that we wanted to reach with this study.
I think we've got time for a couple more questions before we close. Justin, and I think Peter, you had another one. Is that right? And then we'll close from there. So Justin.
Cool, thanks. Yeah, just expanding on those same set of ideas really about using the tools in an exploratory way rather than proving things, statistically, etc. I wonder if you could expand a bit about the circumstances of putting the paper together, and that kind of the context of how you produced it. Or did this come out of a big funded project? Was it a passion project of you and your colleague? Did you have the support of a DH centre? Were you plugging away on your own, trying to justify to your colleagues why you were spending the time with these tools, or whatever? I'd be interested to hear.
Yeah, wow, that's again a terrific question. This wasn't part of any funded project, so this was really something that we did because we were interested in it. It started out, Joris and me talking about wanting to do something together. We had this data set. We both like to do a bit of programming, although I have to say in this case, Joris did all that. So I was more responsible for the theory and the narrative. He did all the analyses, and he coded all the things that we needed to do these. But it was really because we like doing a study like this, so studying something that we're interested in as a historical, as a substantial question, and we liked doing something together. So that's how we set it up, and that does mean, of course, that you cannot move as quickly as you sometimes want to, because, well, things come at your path, right? Things like teaching and what do I know? Yeah, because we did really like it. It's something that you simply in some spare hours or a spare day work on. So it was really well. Once we had the general idea, Joris would run some tests, and he would send me the output and said, "Well, what do you think? Can you see something in this?" And then we discussed again, and yeah, that's how the whole thing progressed, really. Yeah, it was really fun to do, and we're now, well, still in the talking stage, but talking about doing a follow-up on public media. So a similar kind of study, but not on political speech, but on newspaper data. We're really lucky in the Netherlands to have these data sets, right? So those parliamentary debates, 200 years, but also newspaper data, yeah, at least until the 1990s, but then also dating back to, I don't know, the 16th century or so. So it's really great to think about questions that have this longer lifespan, yeah, and then experiment and simply start somewhere. So that's how we worked in this case.
Thanks, Pim, and thanks so much for saying something about your future plans, because as everyone in the seminar knows, that's often the question Richard would ask, which is like, what are you going to do next? Peter, for the final question.
Thanks, James. It's probably quite an involved question to be the last one, but I'll go for it anyway. Again, this is about what's going on in the background, and specifically about language change. And it's which is actually, and it's a question about religious change, secularization more generally. If I've understood it's not quite my thing, but if I've understood some of the literature around religion in the Netherlands in the 60s and 70s, it's caught up in the same movement of fairly rapid secularization as happens quite a lot across quite a lot of the rest of Europe. People have been stopping going to churches for quite a while at this point. But what seems to happen in this period is a rapid collapse in people's framing of their lives and their understanding of themselves and time in religious and therefore kind of sort of future-looking eschatological terms, if that's a term. And I just wonder whether you see that there's any kind of, I mean, that's a super hard thing to nail down, but if as a population or the discourse changes such that we stop thinking about things in terms of an unfolding destiny, and which has a kind of religious frame to it, that will, I think, affect the way in which we start to think and talk about the future, as well as to stop talking about the future, as you say. I wonder whether you've sort of seen any kind of religious stroke secularization angle in the back of all of this.
Wow, yeah. Wonderful. That's really difficult, yeah. But again, it is, you're onto something here, I think. Religious parties have been quite dominant in Dutch Parliament and still are. And when I say religious parties, yeah, they're quite orthodox, right? As some at least are. My guess would be, what struck me is that we quote relatively many of MPs from those parties. So my guess again would be that they are still the people responsible for those high frequencies of the word future in parliamentary speech. That's something that they still talk about, that they have their eyes fixed on, whereas my guess would be if they weren't represented in parliament, that there would be a lot less of that particular talk. It almost seems that as if they feel themselves responsible for still keeping talk about some kind of faraway future life in parliamentary debate. This warning finger that we shouldn't only focus on the present, but there's something coming after. But I should say that's not really more than an intuition or a hunch. But like I said, yeah, it is a super interesting theory, and I do believe that there's something to that religion does play an interesting role here. And I'm sorry I cannot say anything more substantial about that.
I think it's a wonderful answer, Pim, and I think Peter's apologizing for his difficult last question, but in a way that kind of represents the seminar, in a way that we all come from different places and we'll have kind of different kind of backgrounds and interests, and that does shape the kind of questions that we ask. So I think there's a few things left. I think one thing we need to do is thank Pim for a wonderful talk and for fielding our many and various complex questions. So thank you so much, Pim.
Well, thank you.
I'd also like to thank the sponsors of the Richard Deswarte Prize, including the School of Advanced Study here at the University of London, Tim Hitchcock, Webster Research and Consulting, and the Programming Historian, who made the prize lift up a little bit more than just being a paper award. And I should say, Pim, at some point, and I don't know if it's arrived yet, at some point a certificate will be arriving in the post. Which was the slide I had up at the beginning. So hopefully you'll find that in your pigeonhole soon.
It didn't yet, but I'm looking for it every day.
Good. Well, that will be down to my university post system actually sending it out as quickly as I hope they would. So let's see when it arrives. So thank you so much, and thank you everyone for attending. Before we close, I just want to say this is, as I said at the beginning, the first of our series this term. Our next seminar will be one of our now kind of regular postgraduate seminars. On the 6th of December, we'll have a postgraduate panel covering topics including video games as public history and the design of database systems for historical scholarship. And that will be an online-only seminar before we move into having a hybrid postgraduate seminar after the new year, and then conclude with a yet to be fully spec'd out sort of reading group / discussion group in the spring. But I just think we should thank Pim once again, and thank everyone who attended online as well for joining the inaugural Richard Deswarte Prize seminar. So thank you, everyone. Yes, please give your autographs to Joris. Yeah,
I will, and thank you so much for having me.
Thank you. All right. Bye-bye.
Bye.